Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan coming to you from windy Fort Lauderdale. Sorry about the background noise, it's unavoidable on this one, but that's okay because I'm talking about U.S. politics today, specifically the debt ceiling issues. For those of you who don't obsess about the ins and outs of what's going on in Washington, I understand if you don't understand what's going on, that's totally fine. The very short version is since the United States runs a significant budget deficit, that requires approval from Congress to raise the funds that are necessary to run the government. And so every couple of years, whenever the White House and Congress are in different hands, whoever's in Congress tries to use this issue as leverage to get political concessions in one way or the other. Rarely happens at all when the same party controls both houses, but since we're in a divided government right now, the Republicans are trying to wring some concessions out of the Biden administration. Now, if the United States were to not increase the debt ceiling, that would mean that the United States would no longer be able to raise capital in order to fund government activities. And that would hit everything, whether it's Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid or the military or the food stamp programs. Basically, the government would have to triage and decide what not to spend money on and actually live within its means. Now, there is no one that I know who has two brain cells to rub together in Washington who thinks that a default on U.S. debt or a collapse of the U.S. government functioning would be a good idea. So usually this is just used for political theater and in order to generate a pretext for getting some concessions, and both parties have played that game. The reason that this has gotten a lot closer to the wire with us now within a month of the United States actually defaulting or entering into budgetary crunch is because our political system has shifted significantly. Now, for those of you who have been following me for a while, you know that I'm of the belief that we're going through a political transition that we go through every once in every generation or two. And when that happens, the factions that make up the parties move around. They jump ship, and maybe they become swing voters, maybe they switch sides. And while that's going on, everything is remarkably fluid and very angry, and social media certainly hasn't helped. The stage that we're at the moment is that Donald Trump succeeded in excising the fiscal and the business communities from the Republican coalition, but he's also succeeded in bringing the unions into the Republican Party from the Democratic coalition. And Joe Biden, now that he's president, has been at least partially successful at breaking up the unions and the Republicans and trying to get the unions back. And what this means is that the unions, the fiscals, and the business conservatives are all in flux and all are basically swing voters. Now, those are the three factions that know how to do math, for which economics is the core part of why they're involved in politics. And so when you've got the three factions that know the most about things like math and finances and budgeting no longer part of the political core, everyone else who's willing to use the debt ceiling as a political wedge can go a lot farther because there's no longer a group of sane people in the background saying, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to try something else. We're seeing something similar with the Greens. Because we don't have unions, fiscals, or business voters represented in Washington at really any level, the Greens are able to impress their view of economics on a lot of policies. And so we're getting a few things that maybe don't hold up to normal fiscal rules. I still don't think we're going to be facing a default. Still think we're going to have a last-minute compromise. Joe Biden has canceled part of his Asia trip in order to come back and hammer out a last-minute deal. But this is probably going to go down to the wire, and that's simply because our political system is too much in flux. So hopefully that brings a little bit of context, a little bit of detail into what has become an unnecessarily problematic development. And I hope cooler heads will prevail in the long run. All right, that's it for me. You guys take care.
Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here coming to you from Austin, Texas at the 360 Bridge. A lot of you have written in with the same question. U.S.'s credit rating has been dropped. What does it mean? Is this something we should be worried about? The very short version is whenever your credit rating gets dropped, it generally means that you get put into a different category in terms of reliability of repayment. And that means you might have to pay a different amount to service your debt. So imagine, if you will, that you're trying to buy a house and on your last house, you just walked away and left the keys in the mailbox. That's a hit to your credit rating. The next time you try to get a loan, that loan is going to cost you more. And since the United States government is issuing bonds, debt every single day, there's an incremental increase in what we have to pay because of reliability. Now, in the case of something like a country, the wobble, especially for a country the size of the United States, tends to be pretty minor. In addition, the United States is the global superpower. It is the sole global currency. That is not going to change in my lifetime. And as long as that is the case, the United States kind of is the marker of 100% on what you can get. And anyone who's above that kind of gets extra credit. Anyone below that has to compare themselves to the United States. So we're talking at most a couple tenths of a percent in the difference on what financing costs are. Now, in a country the size of the United States, that comes out to something in the tens of billions of dollars a year. So it's not insignificant. The bigger impact is what you're going to be feeling if you happen to be downstream of that, where your debt is indexed to what the U.S. government does. And in that sort of environment, you're talking about your mortgage, your credit card, and everything is going to get a little bit more expensive. Again, from a very low base, but still adds up to tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars a year in additional credit costs. That's not what I see as the big concern. So let me give you two. One relatively minor, one that's really big. First, the minor one. This is only going to get worse. When George W. Bush was president, he issued the most debt, did the most deficit spending of any president in modern history. And then Obama came and was like, hold my beer. And he doubled it. And then Trump was like, well, I'm the best. I'm going to make the deficit huge. And he did so. And now Biden's in, and he's trying to top Trump. So this isn't a Democrat thing. This isn't a Republican thing. This is just a bad math thing. All the fiscal people who have voted based on what the federal government will do with budgets have basically been purged from the political system on both sides. And so we should expect budget deficits to get larger and larger and larger and larger, especially as the baby boomers go from being the largest taxpayers in American history to the largest tax takers, as they go from people earning income and paying taxes to people who are drawing on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid and the like. So this is going to get a lot worse before it might start to get better in, say, the late 2030s when the boomers are mostly all gone. So bad news, but we'll live with it. The worst thing, the concern that most folks in the markets have today isn't that the U.S. can't pay. After all, the U.S. Federal Reserve has the ability to control the money supply with the click of a button and can basically print enough currency to buy all the government debt. And that's exactly what we've done in the last 4 presidents. However, the concern now is that the U.S. won't pay. Donald Trump said we could renegotiate or abrogate some of the debt, which is the sort of thing you hear out of Greece or Argentina or Cuba. And in the current environment, we've had a number of people across the political spectrum, heavier on the right but not exclusively, who have tried to use the ability in Congress to shut things down. Maybe it's a program, maybe it's debt repayment, maybe it's the government itself. But basically saying that we abrogate responsibility for taking care of any of this anyway. And if the U.S. were to just walk away from any of its debt, whether it's because we apply something like modern monetary theory or we just simply shut down the Treasury Department, then all of a sudden you're talking about the biggest financial asset class on the planet being thrown into question. And in that sort of environment, just the fact that this is even a minor risk, just the point that this is a point of discussion, is sending up American credit costs vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And that very rapidly turns into a $1 trillion question. Now, for an economy the size of the United States, a military the size of the United States, the reach of the United States, the U.S. dollar's complete domination of the financial space, a $1 trillion question is almost a rounding error. But you will feel it each and every time you make your credit card payment, get a mortgage, get a car loan. This is now hardwired into the system until such time that we have a twist in our political system that injects a little bit more responsibility. That's not going to be this presidential cycle.
Hey everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from the top of the Turner Cascade in southern Yosemite. That's the Ritter Range behind me. That's where I'm going for the next 3 days. Today we're taking an entry from the Ask Peter forum, which is also actually one that's on my things I do or don't worry about list, and that's the national debt. The United States now has a national debt in excess of 100% of GDP. It's ballooned in recent years. And the question is, isn't this going to be a problem soon? Problem, yes. Soon, no. So let's deal with the problem side first, because that's more obvious. The baby boomers over the last 40 years have voted themselves more and more social benefits, have expanded things like Medicaid, Social Security and such, and then raided the funds that were built to fund them to the point that they're all going to go bankrupt in the next decade or two. In addition, we had George W. Bush with the War on Terror,
and the 9/11 attacks that ran some of the largest budget deficits we'd seen in modern history, followed by Barack Obama, who doubled it in a time of peace, followed by Donald Trump, who doubled it again in a time of peace, and now Joe Biden, which, let's see, we're in August now. I think he's going to top Trump's record this month. Anyway, so yes, budget has gotten out of control, and since Donald Trump purged the fiscal conservatives from the Republican Party, there's no longer a voice in Congress that seems to have any interest in fiduciary responsibility. So we're seeing the budget getting higher and higher and higher, and now that the baby boomers are majority retired, most of them have gone from being taxpayers to tax takers, and it's only going to increase in the years and decades to come. Even worse, the new generation coming in, Generation Z, is the smallest generation we've ever had. So we're going to be looking at constrained ability of the government to raise money through taxes for at least the next 50 years. But you have to keep this in perspective. The Europeans are in a much worse situation demographically. Their equivalent of Gen Z is the same as our equivalent of Gen X, and then their millennials are even fewer and their Zs are even less. So they're going through where we will be in 30 or 40 years right now. And a lot of these countries are already spending as much as 3 times on pensions as we are. Second, look at the Chinese. Technically, their debt isn't national, it's corporate, but you're talking mostly state-owned companies here, so it's more or less the same thing. And since 2008, they have exploded their debt up to 300% of GDP. It would be like if we had done COVID emergency spending every year for 15 years. But then there's Japan. Japan crashed and had their demographic adjustment back in the 1990s. They haven't run a budget surplus since. They haven't had much economic growth since. Much like the Europeans, they've aged out. They have been running deficits of the scale that we had during COVID since the 1990s, which means that they now, if you include pension arrears, which I think you should, have a debt-to-GDP ratio of about 500%, and they're still there. Now, the point of this is not that we don't have a problem. Of course we have a problem. Of course it's going to adjust. Of course we're going to have to pay for it, and it's going to hurt. But you got to keep it in perspective. The United States is the largest economy in the world. We are the safe haven for currency. There is no even theoretical competition for that anymore now that the Eurozone is basically facing obsolescence for demographic reasons. So, if all we do is keep going on the path we're on, we have another 30 years before we're in a Japan-style situation, and Japan's still there now. So, is this a problem? Yeah. Is it going to manifest in ways that we know? Yeah. Is it going to manifest in ways we don't know? Oh, yeah. But not today, and not next year, and probably not next decade either. Oh, one more thing. Oh, and this is the Turner Head Wall. This is the head of the Merced Glacier back in the day. So Half Dome, El Capitan, this is where it all started. This is Turner Lake. Anyway, one more thing. A lot can happen in 30 years. In fact, in those 30 years, we're almost certainly going to see the collapse of the Chinese system and the end of the Eurozone. Systems that are far more indebted than the United States. And as we have seen with every country that has had a debt crisis in the last 70 years, when the money moves because it doesn't want to be there anymore, it almost always comes to the United States. So we are looking at absolutely mythic levels of capital flight as these systems break down, which is only going to buy the United States some more time. All right, I'm done for real. Bye.
Hey all, Peter Zeihan here with a home office video. We're going to take a question from the Patreon crowd, and that is, do I worry about what's going on with the government debt market? Specifically, some of Trump's economic policies have been so erratic that they have been causing foreign investors, most notably the Chinese, to dump a lot of U.S. T-bills on the market. We've had reports that as much as $100 billion has been dumped in a short period of time. And in doing so, the cost of financing that debt has gone up, with the U.S. T-bill briefly hitting about 4.6% before falling back, basically going up a half a percentage point in a day. Doesn't sound like much, but typically if you go up more than like 0.05% in a day, it's kind of a big deal from a financing point of view, because then the U.S. government has to issue more debt to pay for the financing. And since there's $36 trillion in outstanding debt, you move that needle just a little bit, and all of a sudden the US government can get into a lot of financial trouble. And some version of that is what destroyed the premiership of Elizabeth Truss in the United Kingdom a couple of years ago. She instituted a policy of tax cuts that were going to be funded by debt, thinking that the growth would then make up for the difference. And the market absolutely destroyed the pound briefly, and she was out in only a few days. I don't really worry about that from the American point of view. A few reasons for that. First and most importantly, the US T-bill market is the global standard. Whether or not it is the A-list standard is not the point. The point is it's the baseline that everything else trades around. So you can have governments with tighter fiscal ships, like say the Netherlands or Australia or Germany, whose debt is generally considered higher quality than the US, and it doesn't matter because with $36 trillion, we are the baseline for pretty much all financial instruments, and that provides a lot of cushion against big shocks. The bigger problem is whether or not the United States is risking losing its position as the global currency, the global store of value, and the currency of first and last resort. After April 2, when Trump put in the tariffs, it basically would have generated a global meltdown if they would have stuck around. The concern is that there is a flight to safety, and usually in a flight to safety, people go to gold because they interpret as it being inflation resistant, and they go to US T-bills because they're the global standard, and the US economy, if something happens to it, the rest of the world has already melted down. Well, since the cause of the problem was the US government, the T-bills didn't seem to be a particularly viable option, and money went elsewhere. But if you look at the other options, they kind of suck. They went into the European euro, and the euro has risen since the US dollar in the last couple of weeks. But at the end of the day, the countries in Europe are demographically dead, and they can't provide this type of baseline activity that is necessary to underwrite a new store of value or a new source of exchange. And the euro is bigger than all the other options put together. The British pound still hasn't recovered from the Truss episode, and without the empire behind them, they're just a mid-sized country. They could never provide the volume. Canada and Australia, they run a tight ship, but you're talking about countries with under 40 million people in the case of Canada, under 30 million people in the case of Australia. They just can't compare to 330 million that are in the United States, not to mention the United States is a larger economy per capita than any of the others. And that just leaves Japan, which until recently had one of the most manipulated currencies in the world. People like to talk about the yuan, but the yuan is not internationally traded. It's not even an option. There's just nowhere else to go. But even in the worst case scenario where everyone decides they just have to go somewhere else, which by the way does indicate a complete financial meltdown of all countries. Even in that scenario, the United States has an ace up its sleeve that has been used as a matter of course by pretty much every other central bank for the last 30 years. You see, as countries have been demographically declining, their debt has become less and less attractive. And so the central banks have had to step in and monetize that debt bit by bit by bit, basically printing currency to buy up the government debt. It's not that the U.S. doesn't do this, but the U.S. has never done this on the scale as everyone else has done it. And since the COVID crisis ended, the Federal Reserve has basically been cleaning up its balance sheet month by month by month. And so there's a lot of wiggle room for the Fed to do just that. Now, that would still have consequences. But we're talking here about an end-of-the-world scenario, which is kind of my specialty. And in that scenario, you basically would have the Federal Reserve monetize large portions of the debt and become the buyer of government debt of first and last resort. In that scenario, the existence of the US T-bill as the baseline for everyone else would be a little bit different, but it wouldn't stop. So having that in your back pocket gives you a lot of options that nobody else has. Don't feel great about it. We'll be okay on this measure.